Today's Amud is being learned, of course, L'Schud Yehoshua ben Diana, Yael bat Rivka, Menashe ben Asi. Today's Amud is also being learned, L'Refuah Shlema of Yaakov Meir ben Ahid, and today's Amud is being learned as well, Le'ilu Nishmat Tzipora bat Yitzchak. We are still in Daf Yudchet Amud Bet, really the first wide line. We started a story that we didn't have the chance to really finish it. The Gemara finished up the story of Rabbi Meir, how Rabbi Meir was the brother-in-law, the son-in-law really of Rabbi Chanina ben Teradion, and the daughter of Rabbi Chanina ben Teradion that was sentenced to be in Kubash al-Zonot. The sister of hers, which is Beruria, the wife, the legendary wife of Rabbi Meir, said, it's not right. You got to go and somehow get her out. And miraculously, Rabbi Meir goes and gets her out, which puts basically a target on the back of Rabbi Meir. And they put his picture by the gates of Romi, and they say, whoever sees this picture, this is a wanted man, not just by the Jews, but we want him for a different reason. And somebody finally sees him. He has to run for his life, and he has to pretend that he's not Rabbi Meir, whether or not he enters a brothel or he goes to a non-kosher restaurant, so to speak, and puts a finger into the food and sucks a different finger to pretend that he is not Jewish. All these are tremendously thought-provoking, halachically speaking, as a mutar to show that you're not Jewish, right? Especially going to Bet Zonot, we just mentioned before, harchek mipetach beta, al tikrav, right? But nevertheless, Rambam takes these Gemaras very seriously. Rambam, in a letter that he wrote later on, became perhaps one of the most famous, if not the most famous, letter that Rambam ever wrote in his life, called Igerat Hashmad, that was written mainly addressed to the Moroccan Jews who were being prosecuted and they were in very difficult times because of the spread of the Islamic revolution, basically, in back in the day. Again, you have to understand that Islam grew from a very small group in Mecca and Medina when Muhammad started his thing with his family only in the beginning, and then it spread, and became, for instance, Iran was a Zoroastrian, Zartushti country. The entire country was Zoroastrians, and they were basically forced converts to Islam, and they grew actually to the gates of Vienna until 1924, so to speak. It was just expanding and growing until they, with the industrial revolutions, generated money. They pushed them back to the Middle East countries, and then Ataturk in Turkey that kind of like put an end to the caliphate. It's a basic thing, but in the time of the Rambam, about 100 years ago, still it was very fast growing. And Rambam had to write it out because some of these people, what was happening was they became like Moronos, but different in a different way, not like in Spanish Inquisition, but they became Moronos that hiddenly they were keeping the mitzvot and so on. And this Rishon wrote, the one that the Rambam is addressing in that letter, he wrote that this is not being Jewish and you have to give your life up and all that. And Rambam is very angry with him, actually. So he brings the story of two stories that he focuses on. Is one, the story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus that we had in Daf Yud Zayin, right? How he said, Ne'eman alaya dayan, right? Which we mentioned that according to the Meromeh Sadeh, really, and historically also, that does not seem to be actually the pshat in the Gemara, but certainly he brings this Gemara in Daf Yud Chet, and that certainly is a good proof, but not necessarily for doing Avodah Zarah, but for doing things that save your life from pretending that you're doing something that's asur, right? Rabbi Meir, according to some, showed that he is open to enter a brothel or to eat non-kosher And that was the end of his stay in Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara says because of this, when he realized that he has a serious target on his back, he ran to Bavel. And then the Gemara says something very ambiguous and just leaves it in the air. Says, and there are those who say it was because of the story of Beruria. And nobody knows what the story of the Beruria is. Beruria was a tremendous personality of Torah. Tremendous personality of Torah. The Gemara is Meshabeach her over her father, the Tana, Rabbi Hanina ben Taradion, one of the 10 martyrs. The Gemara really, without saying it directly, is Meshabeach her, praises her over her husband, the Rabbi Meir, who the Gemara in Eruvin says was the greatest of the Tanaim, and every single time that she has a debate with her husband, she wins. Actually, one of the sad ones, you all know what the Eshet Chayil she was before we actually see the surprising end of Beruria, is the Midrash says in Mishlei on Pasuk of Eshet Chayil mi imtza v'rachok mi peninim michra. So Eshet Chayil mi imtza, the woman of valor, the tremendous Eshet Chayil is Beruria. So ze Beruria. And the Midrash there gives a story. You know, Rabbi Meir had a very difficult life. We don't realize this. We studied the life of Rabbi Meir a little bit in Masechet Chagigat After Zayin, when we discussed together the story of Elisha ben Avuya, the Rebbe of Rabbi Meir, who became Elisha Acher. And Rabbi Meir was frustrated and saddened with this, and was the only one that didn't let go of his Rebbe. He said, Chazor becha, Chazor becha. And even afterwards, you know, after his death, he brought him to some sort of kapara, not being able to have that kapara originally. Rabbi Meir brought him to Gehenam, so to speak, in order to start his process of kapara, and then ending with Rabbi Yochanan afterwards. We studied that Maaseh. But even in his familial life, Rabbi Meir had 2 sons. And the Midrash says one Shabbat when he was giving the shiur, both of his sons passed away. The Rahman Litzlan, the Midrash does not say how. Both of them died. And Beruria takes them upstairs, puts them in their beds, covers them with sheets, and doesn't say a word. Rabbi Meir comes after the drasha, after the shiur, comes home, he wants to have Havdalah, he says, Banai echanim. So where are my sons? And she says, oh, maybe they're in Bet Midrash. He says, I'm coming from Bet Midrash. I didn't see them there. He says, let's do Havdalah. We'll see what happens. And he makes Havdalah. He says, Banai echanim. He says, I don't know, maybe they're going to come later. And then he says, Rebbe, Beruria says, I have a she'ela for you. Someone gave me a pikadon, gave me something to keep, something to use, and yesterday and today, they came to take it back. Should I give it to them? She says, Bevadai. Of course you have to give it to them. Pikadon is theirs, it's not yours. You have to give it back to them. She says, okay. And then she takes him upstairs, and she uncovers the sheets, and he starts crying. And he says, Banai, Banai, Rabbi, Rabbi. He says, you're my children in Midot, my Rebbeim in Chokhmah, a tremendous Talmidei Chachamim, these kids. Can you imagine Rabbi Meir saying that about somebody? Like a genealogy of Rabbi Meir together with Beruria. You can imagine what genius kids these were. And he's crying. And she says, look, you just told me, it's a pikadon. Hashem natan, Hashem lakach, Yishem, Hashem Merach. That comes from those words come from this story. Hashem gave and Hashem took, Yishem, Hashem Mevorach. And the Midrash says these are the words that consoled and comforted Rabbi Meir. It's the Isha Chachama, a wife of tremendous wisdom. Can you imagine? Ke'ish asher imot rahamenu. Ken anochim enachem etchem. We just had this in the Haftarah. Like the Nechama coming from a mother, the Nechama coming from a woman, a tremendous woman. You know, you find her in a very strong way, promoting the values of Torah to students of her husband, to the peers of her husband, to her husband herself, always having the Bina Yetera. The Gemara says Bina Yetera is given to women, right? And the deep understanding of people and deep understanding of concepts, that is certainly there with Beruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir. We mentioned, of course, also the Gemara in Masechet Brachot Daf Yud, that there Rabbi Meir even lost it. Rabbi Meir lost control of himself, and he started davening for his neighbors that they should die because they were bothering him so much. They were, converted Jews, minim, which mentioned before based on Rashi is censored. Min is min talmidei Yeshua Notzri Machshemo, right? And they were bothering him, and he says, Hashem, they should check out of this world. And Beruria says, no, we can't do that. And she darshins the pasuk is a complicated drasha, maharsha, chataim, chotim, and she wins. It's Beruria. Now, there's a Gemara in Masechet Kiddushin, and Daf Pei Amud Bet. The Gemara there says, Nashim da'atan kalot. What does that mean? How do we translate that? There's no video on anyone over here. Don't worry, I'm the only one held accountable for this. Simple-minded. It's simple-minded.
Easily swayed.
Easily swayed. That's what it is. Whoa. In other words, you say that. That's the table breaks underneath you. Easily say that. That's correct. So that's a story to tell. Nashim da'atan kalot does not mean that they're fools or, excuse the language, they're stupid. Does not mean that. Because we just mentioned, the Gemara says, Bina Yetera, they have Bina Yetera. Much more than men. Right? Now, the concept is men are more focus-minded on one thing, and that means that when you're on the phone, you cannot do another thing. We only could do one thing at a time, but we do it 100%, right? Women could be focused on a lot of things and compare them at the same time and draw conclusions because they could keep a lot of files open at the same time and have a broad understanding of the world and matters and people. But at the same time, it's less of a lock, so to speak, on one thing. So it could be moved. Datan kalo is light. It could be moved, swayed, right? And that's actually needed tremendously for the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created the world and the relationship of man and woman as husbands and wives and mothers and fathers. We could speak about this for at least an hour. It's not a negative thing. It's a different thing, which is absolutely needed for the combination of a family, the way the responsibility of a father and mother and the relationship of the man and woman is. Now, that's what. But it sounds a little bit of a disability, right? It's like if you would say men don't have bina yetera, right? It depends how you say it. So Beruria did not take this lightly. Rashi, the whole story is brought in Rashi, and we'll read the Rashi together, right? So the only source to this that we know is Rashi in Avodah Zarah Daf Yudchet Amud Bet Feim. Says Rashi, Maaseh de Beruria, shepam achad liglega al sha'amru chachamim. One time she made fun of what chachamim say. Gemara in Masechet Kiddushin Daf Pei Amud Bet, Nashim da'atan kalot, ve amar la, and Rabbi Meir tells us, says chayech, I swear to your life, sofach lehodot ledivrehem. You would at some point come to realize that it is true. So what he did was, he did something unconventional. He told one of his students, he said, go try to see if you could trick her, l'dvar avera. Right? Of course, Beruria is going to kill him the first time, right? Siva le'echad mitalmidav le'nasotah, to test her, l'dvar avera, ve'hifsir bah yamim rabim, relentlessly for many, 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 many moons, he was on her case until she gave in. Doesn't say she did na'avera. She gave in. And then he probably said, you lost the bet. Right?
She gave in to doing something.
Yeah, to doing something. Yeah. She gave in to the Dvar Avera. It doesn't say what happened. Yeah. He probably said, I am the Talmud of Rebbeir, this is my shtar tzivui. Right? It doesn't say if she was over on Avera.
It's permitted to test your...
That again, this is so I'm saying it's a very unconventional thing. The Gemara actually mentions this in two different ways. One is a person that rips something in front of the kids or something of the kid to try to test the kid to see if they're gonna respect their parents. And Gemara says, "Zab mutar." Lifnei iver lo titen mechshol. The Gemara deals with this, and we have a similar case in reverse in Gemara Masechet Kiddushin there, right? The son of Rav Ashi, right? That there his wife would see every time after benching he would daven that Hashem should be matzil him from Yetzer Hara, and she's like, he's so old, we're not even like a husband and wife. He's old now, and she tries to test him, pretending to be a zonah, and so on. The whole story there in the Gemara, right? How is it mutar to do such a thing? That's a again, it's a great question, halachically speaking.
Is this a midrash or a known story, like an actual story that happened?
This is where it is. The source of this is Rashi in Masechet Avodah Zarah, Daf Yudchet Amud Bet, right? So it's a tradition. Again, Rashi was 1,000 years ago, and this was the tradition of Maaseh. Gemara says Maaseh de Beruria. It was so embarrassing that he left. He left Eretz Yisrael and he went to Bavel because of Maaseh de Beruria. So what is this embarrassing experience of Maaseh de Beruria? So Rashi says, when she realized what has happened, she was so ashamed that she hung herself. Now, how is that allowed? Right? How is that allowed? So actually, Shoel Umeshiv in Chelek Bet of his Tshuvot had a tshuva about somebody that was mezaneh with the Eshed Ish, and he wanted to do tshuva, but he didn't want to just do a regular conventional tshuva. He wanted to kill himself. So I am hayav mita, right? I'm going. We find this by the nephew of Rabbi Yossi. The Midrash says nephew of Rabbi Yossi had given in to the Romans. He was mihalel Shabbat befarisya. He was chaval al zman. He was mamash completely turned, and he would make fun. And when Rabbi Yossi was taken to be killed, it was on Shabbat, and he's driving his horse, he's riding on his horse, and mockingly he tells his uncle, he says, "Look at the horse that my master, the Roman Empire, has put me on, and look at the horse that your master, Hashem, has put you on. You're going to be killed." You see how far it was. And they have a conversation through which Rabbi Yossi, I believe, was able to penetrate his heart, and he did tshuva, and he was mekayem, says the Midrash, arba mitot bedin be'atzmo. Right? That's what the Midrash says. Now you find other proofs also. The Gemara in Kiddushin there says actually that there were in the process of the Churban Bet HaMikdash, there were many young boys and girls, 400 pairs that were taken, and they were taken by boat, and they knew that they would be put to do averot and so on, and they all jumped in the sea and they killed themselves, right? And the Gemara Darshan is a pasuk Mimesudot Yam, right? So Shoel Moshe brings all of this, brings also Rabbi, the Elazar ben Durdaya that we had in previous stuff. And he pushes off all of them basically. He says Elazar ben Durdaya didn't kill himself, he cried until he died. And Beruria, who says she was right? Who says she was right? That because of tshuva you could kill yourself. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe they never did a hesped and they buried her outside the Jewish cemetery. You don't know he was right. But he does say that from the and also the people who jumped, the 400 persons that jumped into the sea, maybe that's because they didn't know if they're going to withstand the yisurim and the torture not to do averot. So that you see, that's mutar perhaps for a person to do that, right? Chanya Mishal Bazaria, the Tosafot says in Masechet Ketuvot Daf Lamed that they would have not withstand the yisurim if they would be mnagdule, if they would lash them and torture them, they would have actually bowed to the palchul etzalma. They would have done it. So he's unsure. He has one Gemara that he says is a proof, but nevertheless, again, this is a heavily debated and a very unclear area in halacha, whether or not it would be mutar for a person to do this, right? the story of Beruria is not to be taken as face value that a person could be actually doing this. She was, of course, a very proud woman, and she says the Sholem Hashim, maybe she actually made a mistake. It was not a proper action in the process of tshuva to have done. So therefore, we don't know. And again, says that Rabbi Meir was so embarrassed that he left the country from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel because of this. Now, Ben Yoyada, the Ben Ish Chai, writes that it's not because of embarrassment that he left, but because such a churban came through his hand. He never meant it to be like this. He wanted to prove a point to her, right? He never knew that from embarrassment she's going to go do this, right? You have to understand, the Gemara says Masechet Ketuvot, and Daf Yud, and later on, Sugya of Tzedakah over there, that women's embarrassment is much more potent and strong than a man's embarrassment. The Gemara there says that's why we take much more seriously the need of a tzedakah of a woman. Again, nowadays, Baruch Hashem, many of the aniyim that come around, they're richer than me and you. I've seen this woman that comes here, and I've seen she drives a fancy Lexus. It happened to be that I saw her get into her car one of these days. But sometimes they're rich, they're not necessarily dying. The aniyim, the Gemara talks about, there are people who would die out of starvation if you wouldn't help them in the next 5 minutes, right? And the Gemara says that's much more important to prioritize the woman, because they're so embarrassed that from embarrassment, they could not ask and let their kids die out of a starvation and not ask. The busha of a woman is a stronger feeling, right? So therefore, that's to be taken seriously. He didn't know necessarily that how the reaction is going to be, and says the Ben Ish Chai, he accepted galut on himself for the kapara of what came under his hand, the death of his wife Beruria, and that's basically brings another aspect of difficulty in the life of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir was a person that, when we say Elakad Meir Aneni, if it's a reference to Rabbi Meir, you also understand that Rabbi Meir was a personality that went through a lot of difficulty, and yet he was so positive. He's the one that says Choshishin Demiut, even if there's a little chance, we are concerned and hopeful for that little chance that there is. We don't go after Rov. That's a tremendous lesson for life, and B'ezras Hashem will continue this in the days to come.